Well, thank you so much for inviting me today and for that wonderful introduction. Really happy to kind of talk about a specific topic and the kind of benefits of innovation that are already there, some of the potential that hasn't been met. But I'm going to start off by kind of giving a brief history of tobacco and smoking, what governments have done to try and crack down on it, what successes they've had, spoiler, not actually that many, and where innovation can come in to address some of the issues caused by tobacco use. So for those who are unaware, the first tobacco use has been around for a long time. Humans have enjoyed nicotine for at least 12,300 years, a recent estimate coming out. Some research in Nature found some tobacco seeds in a fire pit about 12,000 years ago. And then when it comes to kind of more recent history, when Columbus visited Cuba, when Columbus went to Cuba and met some of the natives there, they were already using tobacco. Some kind of foreshadowing here from this account from a Dominican friar, Bartolome de las Casas, talking about these muskets, as we will call them, they call tobaccos. I was telling the Spaniards that used them, I was reprimanding them, this was a vice. They replied they were unable to cease using it. I do not know what relish or benefit they found in it. And fast forward almost half a millennium from that first kind of introduction of tobacco to European smokers, around 1.2 billion people worldwide now are regular cigarette smokers. And in the UK, that translates into about 7 million of us, around 13% of the adult population. And I'm sure this will come as no surprise to anyone at all. Smoking is actually quite bad for you, at least smoking cigarettes is quite bad for you. Shocker, I know, really interesting talk so far. Biggest cause of preventable deaths in the UK, causes the overwhelming majority of lung cancers, increases the risk of various other health conditions. And to put that in kind of quantifiable terms, the average smoker will lose around a decade of their life expectancy compared to someone who'd never smoked. Now, as I said, you all presumably already know this, that smoking is bad. So why do people continue to smoke if it takes 10 years off your life? Is it because they're not aware? Well, certainly in the UK, since 2002 at least, the vast majority of smokers are fully aware of the risks of smoking. American smokers, interestingly, consistently overestimate the risk of smoking when it comes to lung cancer. So it's not really an information deficit. People are addicted. It's not a kind of rational decision. It's just pure addiction. And actually, if we made their decisions for them, wouldn't that be a lot better? Because they're just wrong and they're not thinking straight. Well, even if you buy into that theory of addiction, and I, for one, do not, it would only be part of the story, because a significant proportion of smokers say they have no desire to quit whatsoever. They're very happy to be addicted to nicotine in cigarettes. In the UK, around 40% of people want to quit in the next year, and only 10% want to quit within the next 3 months. So there's a lot of smokers who just don't want to quit. And this kind of ignores what, when you speak to smokers, and I'm sure I believe there are some of you in this room at this very moment, the various benefits that people report from smoking now, whether that's going out during a club night and having cigarettes outside in the smoking area, creating a sense of identity, it's enjoyable. Nicotine is a stimulant. That feels quite nice for some people who like stimulant effects. If you're bored, smoking can be quite pleasant as well. There's some evidence around how nicotine can have positive mental performance effects. Some speculative recent research suggesting it may even temporarily boost IQ by 2 to 3 points if you use nicotine. But yes, governments have, in their infinite wisdom around the world, decided that smoking as a vice needs to be stamped out. In the UK, we've set a goal to be smoke-free by 2030. That smoke-free is 5% prevalence of smoking population. So the kind of three major things that governments have done around the world on this topic are obviously higher taxes. If you raise the price by enough, people will stop doing it, apparently. In the UK, we have something called the tobacco duty escalator that means that the price of cigarettes goes up by default 2 percentage points above inflation every single year. And that's aside from extra taxes that are being discussed as well. There's restrictions, regulations, and bans. Plain packaging is the kind of obvious one, the one that's been most prominent in public health debates. But also more recently, we've had suggestions of individual cigarettes having health warnings printed on them. In this independent Khan review the UK government put out recently, also had some real doozies in there, suggested that we make cigarettes neon green and brown in order to reduce their appeal. Now, for anyone who knows what sobriety cocktails are, any smokers in the room, you know that that does the complete opposite. And then finally, the kind of, I guess, government-funded carrot rather than the stick here is taxpayer-funded stop smoking services. So how have those worked out? Well, on tobacco tax, the kind of obvious, you put up the price of something, it goes down, economics 101. Economics 102 is about price elasticity of demand. And shockingly, smoking prevalence is not particularly responsive to increases in price. A lot of people respond, instead of just quitting smoking, they switch to cheaper brands, for example. They switch to other cheaper products, roll your own tobacco as opposed to packs of cigarettes. Or indeed, they simply say, well, I'm not going to get my cigarettes from the off-license anymore. I'm not going to get my cigarettes from the supermarket. I'm going to buy them on the illicit market because it's an awful lot cheaper. And most kind of estimates of the impact of tobacco taxation on smoking prevalence, it does have some effect. If you put up the price of a pack of cigarettes by £1 million, no one would smoke legal cigarettes anymore, presumably. But nonetheless, it doesn't seem to affect the long-run smoking prevalence trend by very much, and it has all these unintended consequences when it comes to substitution towards the illicit market. In the UK specifically, we've seen the tobacco tax gap, the gap between the amount of money we should be raising by tobacco taxes and the amount that's actually raised. That's kind of plateaued over recent years, despite us spending an awful lot more money on enforcement efforts to try and crack down on the illicit. Moving kind of more broadly into other policy, things like plain packaging or green cigarettes or whatever else the kind of public health people will come up with next, there's actually a lot of skepticism that any of these measures have any impact whatsoever in terms of the smoking rate, whether that's smoking initiation or prevalence or quit rates. This paper from 2017 found that none of the kind of popular tobacco control policies, except price, except the tax lever, had any noticeable effects on smoking initiation. And I wanted to kind of talk about plain packaging specifically as a good example of why might this be the case. So there's two real theories that are had about advertising in plain packaging for cigarettes. The first is that, oh look, pretty colours, I wasn't going to smoke, but now I am. The second is, I'm going to smoke, but I like these pretty colours on this pack more than the other pretty colours on the other pack. So to kind of translate that into economics terms, advertising either it may increase the size of the overall market, it may create new demand, or the kind of alternate theory is that brands simply have people differentiate between specific products rather than deciding to take up smoking. In general, in my view of the economics of advertising research literature, it tends to be the former. When you have new products come to market, sometimes advertising can boost the overall demand for them as people find out about them for the first time. But in general, it tends to be people choosing one brand over another. That seems to have been borne out in practice, at least a few studies that I've highlighted here suggest basically no evidence that plain packaging affected smoking prevalence, no statistically significant impacts in the UK. And of course, again, you have the unintended consequences from ill-thought-out government intervention. This is a fantastic Sun headline from a few years ago when plain packaging was being debated in the UK. And it was quoting an Indonesian forger of illicit cigarettes, and he even punched the air as he mocked Prime Minister David Cameron. Plain packaging, I support the UK government because it was going to be a boon to his illicit cigarette business. Rather than having to kind of copy the complex packaging, you could simply copy the new olive green packaging much cheaper. And then finally, this kind of taxpayer-funded stop smoking services. They clearly have some impact or some effect on smoking prevalence, but their use has been in decline pretty significantly for at least a decade. Fewer and fewer people are using them. and that's especially true during the pandemic, but also seems to be true after it as well. In context, the current measures that the government has in place to try and bring down the smoking rate. They've set this questionable smoke-free 2030 target. Different countries in the UK have different ones. I think Scotland is 2034, as is Wales, Northern Ireland slightly later. And I think first off, it's worth questioning this is a pretty miserable target. Most smokers don't agree that the government should set such a target. Smoking is arguably just an individual choice with some second-hand or societal consequences that can be mitigated through taxation. But nonetheless, they decided to push ahead with this anyway. And they don't seem to be doing a very good job. They say 2030 is the target. The kind of projections that I've recently done for the ASI say it's more likely to be 2039 for England. For Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, we're going to miss the targets as well, 2036 to, in Scotland's case, more like 2045 for achieving that 5% prevalence rate. And other recent estimates have said they're going to miss that target as well. And this is with all of those interventions already in place. All of the things, the taxation, plain packaging, this is accounting for a new extra tax on top of the existing tax, a polluter pays levy, as they call it, and it's not going to achieve their target. To translate that into kind of raw numbers, that's millions of additional smokers would need to quit if this target was to be achieved in the first place. There's also, I think, in terms of government priorities, again, from my comments on the panel about inequality, you may guess my own opinion on this, but there is an inequalities angle they're very concerned with as well. The fact that people who tend to be on lower incomes are more likely to smoke, people from poorer regions of the UK are more likely to smoke as well, a significant issue for the government's levelling up agenda. There's also a kind of education inequality aspect to this as well. People with fewer qualifications are more likely to smoke. Millennials, people aged 25 to 34, surprised me when I found this, more likely to smoke than people aged 65 and older. There's a very obvious reason for that in some ways, and a not so obvious one as well. And kind of translating that target being missed into areas of the UK, in Glasgow you need 30,000 more people to quit. If you want to hit the target, in Doncaster you need another 25,000 people. So government sets itself a target, misses completely. It's also expensive to smoke, mainly because of tobacco taxation. The average smoker spends around £2,000 in the UK every year on cigarettes. And that translates into pretty big chunks of people's disposable income, especially those on the lowest income. So poorest smokers, the poorest 10% of smokers, now spend nearly 15% of their disposable income every year on tobacco. That's a huge imposition, a huge increase in their cost of living. It's got worse since 2016. So what's the solution? Whether you're someone who does actually think the government setting targets for smoking prevalence is good, or whether you just want a win-win solution whereby smokers can continue to enjoy nicotine without some of those negative health consequences, the answer is that cigarettes are increasingly becoming outdated technology. Any SNUS users in here? Anyone familiar with SNUS at all? Yeah, so, okay, we've got two people familiar with SNUS. So SNUS on the left there, I'll explain what these are in a second. Heated tobacco in the middle, and then e-cigarettes / vaping on the left. Now I'll start off with SNUS. We just had Johan, who I think has Johan left now? Or? He has, that's a shame. So Sweden, fantastic example of innovation in tobacco harm reduction. So SNUS, I've got a similar product in right now. It's a smokeless tobacco product. You put it in between your gum and your top lip, and it gives you a nicotine hit. And this is something that's been around for actually centuries, but the kind of recent growth in it, especially in Scandinavia, started since the 1970s. And despite the fact that it's played a really important, a key role in reducing Sweden's smoking rate, it's banned in the entirety of the EU. Sweden got a special exemption. It's also available in Norway and Switzerland as well. And I think the story of Sweden here is probably the best illustration of where this technology has achieved these sort of positive public health outcomes whilst letting people continue to use their nicotine rather than trying to change people's behavior through the stick of government intervention. The better technology has come around to make it unnecessary. So one study here, the availability and use of snus has been a major factor behind Sweden's record low prevalence of smoking. And it seems like actually there's no significant difference in life expectancy between people who've never smoked and people who use snus as well. So huge success, banned across the entirety of the EU. The next one is heated tobacco. This is a more recent innovation. Obviously snus around for centuries, growing the past few decades. Heated tobacco uses a kind of heating element. It can be like a metal blade, or it can be a device that kind of runs around something that looks a bit like a cigarette, contains tobacco. It produces a nicotine-containing aerosol rather than smoke because combustion doesn't take place. The sort of burning of the tobacco doesn't take place. And there's been various unsuccessful attempts to try and create these devices. In the 80s, they failed miserably in the US market because apparently they smelled absolutely terrible and they didn't feel enough like smoking a cigarette. But more modern products have started to come onto the market around the world since the mid-2010s. And there's been, since that kind of modern burst of innovation, there's been billions invested, mainly from the tobacco companies in the case of heated tobacco products, to try and improve things like the battery life of them, to make them feel more like smoking a cigarette, for example, different flavors, lower size, and just generally the experience of using it. And this seems to have had some success in Japan specifically. This is probably the kind of key case study here, where once it was introduced onto the market in Japan, where vaping is banned, interestingly, so this was the only real substitute for cigarettes, you saw pretty significantly reduced cigarette sales as people switched to these heated tobacco products instead. I think initially it featured on a popular Japanese game show, and then search history spiked. People started to find out about this product, and it now outsells Marlboro cigarettes in Japan. And then from the UK, it seems like there's pretty solid evidence that there's at least some reduction in risk as a result, and there's quite a substantial reduction. It exposes users and bystanders to substantially fewer harmful compounds compared to smoking cigarettes. And then the final one with the most relevance, I think, for the UK is the story of vaping e-cigarettes. I'm sure most of you are familiar with how e-cigarettes work, what they do. They heat up a e-liquid that releases nicotine, a nicotine-containing vapor. And actually, e-cigarettes were first kind of patented, although never produced, all the way back in 1930. But most recently, the kind of modern devices that have really taken off in recent times, invented by a Chinese pharmacist, Hon Lik, a personal hero of mine. He's someone who, his father had passed away from smoking-related illnesses. He himself was a smoker, and he said, actually, I'm going to tinker away, I'm going to blow up a few fingers in my garage, and I'm going to come up with an alternative that could arguably be better for my health. And since Hon Lik's initial device came onto market, there's been huge waves of innovation making these products better, more appealing to smokers to switch to, whether that's different flavors, different ways of delivering nicotine. You can have nicotine salt e-liquids now, for example, better battery life. I used to have an Adam Smith Institute logo on my vape screen, for example. That was a big reason why I made the switch myself. Lots of innovation taking place. And the UK is kind of the best example, I think, or one of the best examples in the world of how this can be successful in public health terms. The usually extremely nanny status public health authorities have kind of bucked the trend in this particular case and broadly got behind e-cigarettes. It's a very weird phenomenon. The sort of people you'd be arguing about plain packaging with are on the same side as you when it comes to vaping debates. Very surreal. But Public Health England, since 2015, and still to this day, thinks e-cigarettes are around 95% less harmful than smoking. And a recent Cochrane review, kind of gold standard evidence review, concluded that there's high certainty e-cigarettes are better than nicotine replacement therapy, encouraging people to make the switch. So instead of the government-funded stop smoking services, the more effective way is a consumer-friendly, market-driven innovation. And yet, of course, as with all areas, there are significant barriers to innovation. I put EU, got to be kidding me, because most of this comes at the EU level. There is, however, some domestic issues as well for the UK specifically. For example, the EU says you can't have more than 20 milligrams of nicotine in your e-liquid. If you're a heavy smoker, it's not really going to be ideal. If you want to get a proper nicotine hit, you're less likely to make the switch. I mentioned the EU-wide ban on snus as another example. The kind of key one for me, though, is the communications restrictions. So if I'm a vape company and I'd like smokers to use my product, and I want to tell them, hey, Public Health England says this is 95% less harmful. I'm banned from doing that. I can't do that. And I can't really market very much at all. So there's some issues there. And then the threat of further domestic regulation. So very recently, the Action on Smoking and Health, kind of nanny-statist tobacco control body, said we need to put a £4 tax on disposable vapes because the kids and they're ruining the environment. Flavour bans have been talked about as well, and even plain packaging for vaping. So some kind of reasons for pessimism, I think, that apply to the UK, but also to a number of other countries. The US springs to mind as well. More and more people, more and more smokers specifically, have tried vaping, but the kind of rate of use of vaping has remained relatively steady for the past almost a decade now. And a lot of those people have tried vaping and then gone back to smoking cigarettes as well. And perhaps one part of the reason for that is that despite the official government public health body saying these things are 95% safer, etc., the majority of smokers still are wrong about their perceptions of the risk of vaping. If you look at this graph from Action on Smoking and Health, the proportion who are answering e-cigarettes are a lot more or equally harmful compared to cigarettes, the yellow line. It's been going up. It's actually getting worse. This is despite these products becoming more available, more knowledge being available to consumers. So there's a kind of big failure there. But at least they know that e-cigarettes exist, right? Most people are aware that e-cigarettes exist. The majority of smokers have never heard of heated tobacco products. The vast majority of smokers have never heard of nicotine pouches, which is the kind of legal version of snus that is allowed in the UK, the thing I'm using at the moment. And you contrast this with the kind of expert consensus from all these different bodies, Office of Health Improvement and Disparities, OHID, Cochrane reviews, even the nanny statists themselves, Action on Smoking and Health, saying Swedish snus is much less harmful than smoking. Committee on Toxicity saying that nicotine pouches are like to be associated with an overall reduction in adverse health effects. And they even think that change is needed. They even, in their most recent evidence report, said we need to provide smokers with more accurate information, in complete contrast to this near marketing ban. So a few kind of policy solutions that spring to mind and things that we've been arguing for at the ASI for quite a while to encourage innovation in this space, just to allow it at all in the first place. The first is lifting this nicotine level cap on e-cigarettes, legalizing snus, pretty clear one, just let people access the product, and also granting greater marketing freedoms to allow people to communicate, hey, this product is safer than smoking or less harmful than smoking. And some kind of evidence behind that nicotine limits thing. So you compare in the US where there aren't nicotine limits. This is Juul research. I'm sure a lot of you here are familiar with Juul specifically. In North America and the US, they can have much higher levels of nicotine. And shock horror, when you have higher levels of nicotine, people tend to be more successful when they try to quit smoking compared to the EU. In the UK, it's been over 4 years since the government said we're going to review this ban on snus, we're going to take advantage of our new post-Brexit freedoms. They didn't, they haven't. In fact, the most recent news on this is they said, we're not going to do the review anymore, we have no plans to do it, but we're going to keep the ban because we feel like it. They didn't actually give a reason. And you contrast that to the US, where it's been 3 years since they gave a modified risk order to a few snus products, where they said, yeah, you can market this as reduced risk, effectively. And then on heated tobacco, if you ask smokers the number one reason why they go back to smoking after they try vaping, it's because it doesn't feel anything like smoking a cigarette, which it doesn't. You know, it's unicorn candy flavor or whatever it might be. It doesn't feel like tobacco. It doesn't satisfy their preferences. We've got this innovation that has created a new product that is closer to smokers' preferences, and yet most people aren't aware of it at all. And this stuff matters. It seems like there's a strong relationship between thinking that vaping is less harmful than smoking and quitting smoking. But there's concerns not just from the kind of EU level. I mentioned that this kind of vape tax being proposed. It was proposed a few years ago as well. Various other countries also have proposed some form of vape tax. From my perspective, there's no economic, environmental, or health justification for this at all. If you kind of take your general theory of taxation, that, oh, you've got a negative externality, you've got a social cost, people will say disposable vapes have a social cost because they contain lithium, and that can harm the environment. One of the ASI's researchers looked at this and found that kind of roughly 1 penny tax would cover the cost of that, not a £4 one. The kind of other concern is youth use. Young people who have never smoked starting to vape instead. There's a few things I'd say about that. The first is that in the UK, the overwhelming majority of young people do not vape. The ones that do tend to be young people who've already smoked cigarettes as well, and actually they might be using vapes as a way to quit smoking cigarettes. But the other thing here is the kind of flavor bans aspect as well. So a lot of the time, if you're switching to vaping, part of the motivation for doing that is because you have access to all these flavors. You can have mint, menthol. I think the one that I used was called unicorn candy or something absolutely ridiculous when I first made the switch as well. So wide variety of different flavors, better able to cater to individual preferences, which are always going to be different. And of course, banning them would reduce that avenue. And a good example of this is when San Francisco decided to ban flavors in vaping. You saw a huge uptick in teen smoking as a result. So well done, great win for government policy there. And then plain packaging for e-cigarettes. If you, and I think there's good justification for this, if you view e-cigarettes as a substitute, or kind of an alternative to smoking, then kind of plain packaging research comes back. People are less likely to switch to your brand, which is e-cigarettes, and more likely to stay with their current brand, which is cigarettes. And to kind of put this into some context, if you met the kind of smoke-free 2030 goal through people switching to these alternatives, you can save millions of years of life. A very collectivist angle, I know, but I think, today's token utilitarian collectivist, so I'm going to say it anyway. And then translating that into specific areas of the UK, 100,000 in Glasgow, 68,000 years of life in Doncaster. Each of those years of life is lived by an individual, I think very important to specify. Let's skip over that. And also these things are cheaper as well, right? We don't tax them, I mean, despite the proposed vape tax, we don't tax e-cigarettes anywhere near as much as we do cigarettes. We don't tax heated tobacco like this. We don't tax nicotine pouches like this. And there can be a significant financial saving here as well, something that the ASI calculated last year. Anything from £800 to £1,600 a year saving if you make the switch. So kind of key takeaway messages here, I think. Traditional tobacco control, incredibly paternalistic, incredibly anti-individual, claims that the state knows better than you do about your decision to smoke cigarettes. It's often very ineffective. Either it doesn't work, or if it does work, it creates all of these negative unintended consequences. Illicit trade is a classic example. You contrast that with the development and the innovation that has led to the development of these smoking alternatives that are increasingly becoming available and taking over the market in some countries. And of course, government, despite this being a solution to its own problem, is still trying to get in the way. And I think this kind of speaks to a broader point about opposition to innovation, not opposition to new technologies. And it's that a lot of the kind of groups, the public health groups, kind of campaign against vaping still. are motivated by the idea that it's more important to change people's behavior than it is to solve the problem associated with their behavior. So rather than let people continue to use nicotine, which by itself is fairly harmless, nicotine does not cause many, or if any, negative health effects in a significant proportion. Rather than do that, they would rather just stop the behavior. This kind of moral puritanical aspect to it that's incredibly frustrating. And I think there's also kind of financial incentives as well. If you look at a lot of public health groups in various countries, the UK being one example, a lot of them are directly funded by the state in order to lobby the state. It's a very weird kind of relationship. It's been termed sock puppeting by a friend of mine, Chris Snowden. And if vaping, if heated tobacco, if SNUS solve this public health problem, they don't have a reason to exist anymore. And they want to exist. They want to continue to get taxpayer funds in order to lobby for neon green cigarettes and in order to continue to lobby for high taxes on vaping. So I will leave it there and go over to questions. Thank you so much for listening.